Shopify is a global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business and sell more with less effort thanks to the Shopify Magic, your AI-powered all-star. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/redcircle, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/redcircle now to grow your business no matter what stage you're in. Shopify.com/redcircle.
Aarti Shah is a business and policy consultant who helps companies in high and middle-income countries achieve environmental, climate, and social impact. As a former senior executive at Thomson Reuters, she oversaw operations in developed and emerging markets, transitioning products from frontier markets to more developed ones. She is a visionary leader with the skills of a CEO and managing director. Aarti graduated from the University of Bristol with French and computer science degrees. She serves as the board chair of Third Horizon Earth and consults part-time for the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture. It's a pleasure to have you on the program, Aarti.
Thank you, Dan, for inviting me. I, by the way, am a huge fan of yours, so it's a privilege to be on your podcast.
The decolonialization of tea is well advanced, but it is also clear that revenue from specialty tea is insufficient to sustain an industry comprised mainly of small and mid-sized farms. Somewhere between monoculture and monopoly, there must be a business model that allows the tea industry to profit while paying living wages with enough left over to invest in addressing serious threats such as climate change. Will you offer listeners an overview from the ground up?
Well, first of all, I agree that there has to be a spectrum, right? And both from a producer and a consumer perspective, if you want to be producing a reliable, perhaps sort of homogeneous product at a certain price point, or you also want to have producers who are looking at the complexity of a tea, Camellia sinensis-based drink. I think there's room for it all. I agree that it shouldn't be either or, but I think regardless of how it is produced and what is produced, I think we do need to start addressing the fundamentals. And let's start with the soil. Right? At the moment, soils generally are degraded, and specifically where tea is grown, especially where synthetic fertilizer has been used over time, those soils have a problem. And I think we would be foolhardy if we didn't start going back to basics and going to the roots, literally and figuratively, and saying, okay, what does the soil need? I do think also that where the processing of tea is concerned, I see that as a huge opportunity to rethink how power and heat are generated and utilized. And when people say, yes, let's make the 19th century boilers more efficient, I will push back on that very strongly to say, why in the global south should we continue to use incineration when we have the likes of Diageo announcing that a Guinness brewery in Dublin will be migrating to heat pumps, right? Yes, I understand that power is still very expensive and unreliable in a lot of these tea-producing countries, but shouldn't that be part of the roadmap? So, and that would help mitigate the other monoculture or the other fossil fuel part of the argument. So whether you're in Kenya and you're talking about eucalyptus, or you're in Northeast India and you're talking about coal and or gas. So I really would like to see everybody along the supply chain really to question their own assumptions about what's working and say, we've got these modern technologies, let's use them. I will say something that might sound counter everything I've just said, insofar as automation is concerned. I do appreciate that tea is grown on slopes in many parts of the world, and therefore has been almost like the last frontier of automation. And I say that word very carefully, not just mechanization. I do think that, it is a plant and that, requires respect, and not just sort of tearing the leaf off just because a thumping great machine can go through the bushes and tear off leaves. At the same time, unless we bring about intelligent automation, the average age of a Kenyan tea farmer is already 65. I'll be talking to you in 5 years' time, and goodness knows what the average age will be by then. And so, again, I do think that when we say, yes, we need to attract young people into agriculture, we need to think very carefully about how we're going to attract them. If you go to a Kenyan tea farm, you may well see somebody using a panga or a machete, or possibly handheld shears, which are motorized. And at the same time, we're working with a company in India which is developing a robot to do both picking of the tea leaf. We are looking at using agrobotics is for pruning. And so whether it's a single level of pruning, as I have typically seen in Kenya today, or the 3 levels of pruning that you might have in a place like Assam, I think what we have to be thinking about is, where do we use technology in a way that creates multiples of benefits, one of which is shared prosperity. I'm not here to change what is agronomically the best practice. What I am here to change is, how do we make that practice more efficient? As I said, attract young people. And in the case of what we're trying to do, we're not just talking about pruning. We're talking about actually putting in the biochar in the soil at the same time, because we actually have access to the soil while pruning is happening. So I do think that it goes back to, what problem do we want to solve? Well, speeding up pruning would be great. Doing it in such a way that it is, that we're able to use the pruning resources for the gasifier, which we can come onto, and then applying the biochar in the soil, and then covering the soil with shaved prunings. It's sort of win-win. We're making maximum use of all the natural resources, and it happens to be a robot that's doing it.
I'm so glad you brought up biochar. I've been championing that since the early 2000s. When you talk about improving the soil, you're using modern technology and a fundamental analysis of the soil to understand what's depleted and how to make the soil more alive and enriched. I like biochar because it's a home for little bugs and all the bacteria to live, but I don't see widespread use of it. Why is there not as much biochar in tea as there could be?
Well, I think generally, from what I've understood, there seems to be less research in tea full stop than other crops. I think specifically where biochar is concerned, we've been working very closely in Kenya with TRICAS, the Tea Research Institute of the Chinese Academy for Agricultural Sciences, and their Kenyan counterparts, so the Kenya's Tea Research Institute. There happens to be a program called the Global Low Carbon Tea Initiative, which is the Chinese, Kenyans, the Germans, and FAO. And we are trying to leverage that program to say, let's do some more systematic research on biochar in tea. So our observational findings till now have mirrored what China has found. I mean, China's done a lot more research than what's happened in Kenya. But it's good to know that with our results do overlap. They have also looked at pH, which is something that we haven't yet looked at in Kenya. But my point here is, and again, it goes back to one of the points I keep sort of banging on about, the challenge in a producer country like Kenya is that it's always relying on other people's funds to do any significant research. I think it would be not unreasonable for Kenyans themselves, both public and private sector, to turn around and say, this is a critical part of our economy. It employs a significant number of people. We should also be putting our own funding into this, because if you're waiting for others, as we've seen over the last few weeks, sometimes that pack of cards can just fall over altogether, or it operates at its own pace if it is still there. So I do think that if a country like Kenya, which is clearly a major producer on the world stage, actually does say, yes, you know what, we are going to put funding, then I think that would help. And as I say, Kenya doesn't need to be on its own. Got a separate project going on around integrated pest management. And since the changing climate has already started impacting productivity in Assam, let's pool our knowledge where we have it, but also let's take a bit of ownership ourselves to say, we're going to fund this.
Congratulations on getting the green light for your biomass gasification project.
So yes, we're delighted to announce that we will be putting up the first gasifier, first CSS gasifier in a Kenyan tea factory. It's a 3-year project which is being funded by UNIDO, the United Nations Industrial Development Organization. And that will allow us to put up a lighthouse pilot, which will be inviting everybody to come and see.
So how does it work?
So gasification is low oxygen thermal conversion of woody biomass. What does that mean? So that means we would take the likes of tea prunings, but also other high carbon biomass like maize shanks and bamboo and sugarcane bagasse. It has to be reasonably dry, so 15% moisture content. And then we put it into this process called gasification, which means it has very limited oxygen. It's not like burning in full combustion with lots of air, right? So it's in a chamber with limited oxygen. It's at high temperature, around 850 degrees. And out of that, we get a synthesis gas, which is cleaner than natural gas. It's less polluting. And from that gas, we put that through a combined heat and power engine, and we generate heat and power. So tea, very briefly, a CTC factory, 10-15% of the energy it requires is electricity, so power, electrical power, and the rest is actually thermal. In the case of gasification, we and the CSS gasifier in particular, we would generate enough power for a 2, 3, 4 line factory. We wouldn't produce enough heat to replace the boilers entirely, but we can reduce the dependency by 15 to 18%. And the heat would be in 2 ways. One, it could go directly to the boilers, or we could produce hot water at 90, 95 degrees. And then the third product of gasification is so the biomass that isn't converted to energy gets converted to biochar. And this is industrial biochar. It's continuously produced. We would configure the system to produce about 15% biochar. So for every ton of biomass, we'd get 150 kilos of biochar. And that will then go back on the soil. Biochar also does attract carbon credits, which would be another sort of revenue stream. In many ways, it's an old technology, but also a new technology, because it has, CSS has been investing a lot in research and development over the last sort of 17, 18 years. They have a very clean system. They use dry scrubbing. So what I'm trying to say is that their technology is quite advanced, and that's why we're partnering with them.
Tea plants in Kenya are spaced less than a meter apart. Farmers plant between 10,000 and 20,000 bushes per hectare, yielding an average of 2,000 kilos of green leaf per hectare, with an all-time high of 3,739 kilos per hectare in 2004. What's the optimal way to grow tea there?
Tea is grown in catchment areas, right? And a catchment area in Kenya may be 1,300 hectares, 1,800 hectares, or it might indeed be sort of 5,000 hectares. So I think we have an opportunity to look at the cultivation of tea from that perspective, number one. Number two, then if you turn around and say, well, we're overproducing, and if we use biochar to help fertilizer be more efficient and therefore increase the yield, then what does that mean? We are starting to free up land. Right? And I think, for the longest time, tea has been sort of tightly packed because you've got to get the most out of that acre or hectare or whatever it is that you're growing your tea on. I do think we need to take a step back and say, okay, what is best for, and I like to think of it as a catchment area, right? So a catchment area serving an existing, and that would be, for example, even the KTDA model, right? So KTDA, the factory will be served by farmers within that area. If you were to turn around and say, well, out of that 1,800 hectares, let's reduce the amount of tea overall to X. Let's use intercropping for its agronomic benefits. Let's put in other crops, whether it's avocado or herbs or whatever else it is. You are starting to bring about biodiversity, and you're starting to look at how to move away from, even over time, synthetic fertilizers, because you're starting to sort of fixate the nitrogen. But that can't be done at an individual farmer level, especially not when a smallholder farmer may well have quarter acre, half acre, 1 acre, under their own management. So I think, again, one of the sort of disruptive ways of looking at this is, let's focus on this at a catchment area. And ultimately that would roll up to a national level. But let's start with each sort of area servicing an existing factory and say, okay, what is the optimal way of growing tea? And let's use all the nature-based solutions we have at our fingertips to make that happen.
If yields per hectare in Kenya are lowered, how do you generate sufficient monthly income during the harvest and receive an annual bonus to sustain the farm?
So I think, first of all, there has to be more distribution of value. I think the producers in Kenya may consider themselves to be shortchanged if you think about the entire value chain. And this goes back to my point at the start that, the buyers, the retailers, they're all absolutely adamant that they're doing the most that they possibly can. Well, if that were the case, then people, the consumers, wherever they are in the world, should perhaps start accepting that they need to pay more for their tea and more for food generally. I think for a very long time, food has been incredibly cheap. We haven't put a value to nature, to the environment, to the soil, to the water. And I think once you start pricing all of this in, and once you start pricing in all the things that you expect the producers to do, quote unquote, for free today, you might find that actually the cost of tea is much higher than you realized. So I think that's the first thing. How do we redistribute value? The second is factories in Kenya that are not always making the best decisions in terms of their own sort of balance sheet, right? So I hear about factories that put in a fourth line, a third or a fourth line for CTC processing. Or I hear about somebody saying, okay, well, orthodox is fashionable, so let's look at orthodox. And even west of the Rift Valley, I was having a conversation with somebody very senior in the Kenyan tea producing ecosystem who said, oh, but if we free up land and our farmers start growing food crops, there are very few urban centers in Western Kenya. And I thought, well, where is that food going to go when Kenya already imports food? And clearly we'd have to have a much longer conversation over what would be the best crops to grow. But I do think that there needs to be a bit more cohesion in terms of, where should these alternative crops be grown? Where are the markets? And actually, fundamentally, where is the demand? right? Today, I keep hearing about people saying, okay, let's start growing XYZ crop, which might be avocado, it might be blueberries, it might be, well, that's all great, but who's going to consume them? Kenya grew its production of tea. It increased by 50% in a decade. Did Kenya actually think about who was drinking that tea? Who was actually going to be drinking that? Was there a demand for it? So I do think that along with the distribution of value, there has to be much more focus on consumer demand. Even in Kenya, if you were to turn around and get people to drink quality tea, as opposed to just throwing a few tea leaves into very milky water with lots of sugar in it, yes, you've got your work cut out for you. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't start. It is possible to change habits. It takes time. So let's do this, right? We're not going to get everybody wanting a specialty cup of tea overnight. But I also don't think that shouldn't stop us from going down that journey. And again, going back to how do you attract a new generation of people into the tea sector, I think that's also a way of doing it. It can start in many different places. But let's take tourism as an example, because I think Kenya has a sizable tourism sector for both international and domestic. And I think that the hotels, the lodges, the campsites, I mean, that for me would be a fantastic place to not just to serve tea at breakfast and lunch and in between, but bring about this whole experience around tea and introduce tea tasting where the visitors are, right? And that wouldn't be so very hard to do. I mean, I think if you invest in having a tea sommelier, somebody who really understands the tea that they're serving, let's also accept that there is room for it all. I think promoting and serving some of the best Kenyan teas should absolutely be encouraged. But also telling people, well, you know what, the typical cup of tea in the Highlands is, you harvest the rainwater, you get fresh milk from the cow, so you milk the cow, and then you throw some leaves and you make it very sweet. And here's a shot of it so that you understand what people drink, in other parts of the country. So, and by the way, that description I've just given you is literally how I drank my first cup of tea in Dakaini when I went to visit my in-laws. That it was pouring with rain. We did take harvested rainwater and the cow was milked in front of me, and they laughed when they heard that I didn't take sugar. But so I think it's creating a certain sort of experience around this would be important. Secondly, government offices. Government is a significant employer in Kenya. And again, we receive visitors from around the world. Well, I do think that if you're walking into any ministry, you should have the right to have a decent cup of tea. It should be a right. It shouldn't just be an expectation. And actually, when I do go to the Tea Board of Kenya, or when I go to KTDA, or indeed any sort of tea producer in Kenya, I actually do look forward to drinking the tea. But that's it. If I go to any conference or any other sort of office, including government office in Kenya, I'm served with this sort of thermos of tea that has been made without sort of any sort of thought or discrimination. So I think that both tourism and government could become much better ambassadors for the tea that is served, and that would start going quite a long way. Kenya has a lot of conferences, by the way, just global conferences, and having 20 people instead of 2 or 3 big, those big things, dispensers of hot water, and actually having people serving tea and engaging people in the breaks and saying that, come and enjoy some of our finest. Again, that's being an ambassador for some of the excellent produce that you can get in Kenya.
Produced by Adavita Studios. Connect your voice to the world.